You're one of a kind now. He's gone.
He spent years disappearing on purpose. It took one boy, one phone, and 11 seconds of video to bring his entire old life crashing back through the front door. This video is an independent, transformative work created for review, criticism, commentary, educational, informational, and entertainment purposes. Any third-party content is used only to support original analysis and is not intended to replace or reproduce the original work. Bryant is not his real name, and for most of this film, the movie lets you sit comfortably with that fact without demanding you interrogate it too closely, which is precisely the point. He lives quietly in a small Mexican border town, running what looks like an unremarkable, modest life, the kind of life built specifically to attract no attention from anyone. Michael Jai White plays him with a deliberate physical stillness in these opening scenes, a controlled economy of movement that reads, on a first watch, as simply the calm confidence of a former fighter who no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. On a second watch, once you know what Bryant actually is and what he is actually hiding from, that same stillness reads as something closer to a survival discipline. A man who has trained himself for years to take up as little space and generate as little notice as humanly possible, because the version of himself that used to move freely and confidently is exactly the version of himself that got people killed. The film does not explain this discipline to you yet. It simply lets you watch a man behave like someone in hiding, long before it tells you who he is hiding from. Into this careful, quiet walks Oscar, a local teenager drifting toward exactly the kind of trouble small border towns like this one manufacture in steady, predictable supply. Oscar has recently lost his mother, a detail the film delivers without much sentimentality, treating it less as a tragic backstory beat to be dwelled on and more as a simple, practical explanation for why a smart, decent kid finds himself with nobody steady enough at home to notice which direction his afternoons are drifting toward. A local gang, run in part by a man named Hector, Hector has already started circling him, offering exactly the kind of belonging, structure, and easy money that grief and boredom make dangerously appealing to a teenager with too much unsupervised time and not enough reason to say no. This is worth naming directly as character psychology rather than simple plot mechanics, because the film is careful to make Oscar's vulnerability feel specific rather than generic. He is not simply a troubled kid because the plot requires one. He is a kid whose most obvious support system has just been removed from his life at the exact moment he most needed it, and Hector's gang is functioning less like an obvious criminal threat and more like the only adult structure currently offering to fill that gap. Bryant notices Oscar the way a man trained to notice threats and vulnerabilities notices everything around him, almost against his own will, and the decision to step in is staged with real restraint rather than as an obvious, immediate rescue the kid impulse. He does not offer Oscar money, or a lecture, or a dramatic intervention. He offers martial arts training, structured, disciplined, physically demanding in a way that gives a grieving, aimless teenager something concrete to organize his attention and his anger around. This choice deserves more credit than most casual coverage of this film gives it, because it reveals something specific about Bryant's own psychology rather than simply setting up the training montage structure the film is clearly building toward. Bryant does not know how to have a conversation about grief. He does know how to teach someone control, discipline, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from mastering your own body under pressure, because those are exactly the tools that kept him alive through whatever violent past the film has not yet shown you. Teaching Oscar to fight is not simply mentorship for its own sake. It is Bryant offering the one language of care he still has fluent access to, and the fact that this generosity comes wrapped in something that will eventually put Oscar in more danger rather than less is the quiet, tragic irony sitting underneath every training scene that follows. The open loop the film plants hardest in these opening minutes is simple and effective. Something happened to Bryant before this story began, something serious enough that an entire new identity and an entire new country were required to survive it, and the film is content to let that mystery sit unexplained while it builds the relationship between Bryant and Oscar on its own terms first. Hold on to that. Everything about how carefully Bryant guards his own visibility in these early scenes, how instinctively he avoids cameras, crowds, and attention of any kind, is about to matter considerably more than it appears to right now, because the entire second half of this story will be triggered by exactly the kind of visibility Bryant has spent years successfully avoiding, delivered not by an enemy tracking him down through old-fashioned detective work, but by something considerably more modern, more accidental, and in its own way more frightening: a phone held by a kid he was only ever trying to help. Hector himself deserves closer attention than the standard genre villain label most casual coverage assigns him, because the film resists making him purely cartoonish even while giving Michael Jai White's Bryant a clear physical adversary to eventually square off against. Hector runs his operation with a specific kind of local, almost paternal authority, positioning himself less as an outside predator than as an established fixture of the same community Bryant and Oscar both live inside, which makes his influence over Oscar considerably harder to simply outfight or out-argue. He is not recruiting Oscar through threats or intimidation in these early scenes. He is recruiting him through familiarity, through the appearance of genuine interest, through exactly the kind of low-stakes friendliness that makes a lonely teenager feel noticed. This mirrors, in a smaller and more grounded register, the same core dynamic running underneath Bryant's own approach to Oscar. Both men are offering the boy attention and structure he is not getting elsewhere, and the film is quietly asking you to notice how similar the mechanics of that offer actually are, even though one man is offering it toward decency and the other toward danger. The training sequences that follow are where the film settles most comfortably into its genre identity, and it is worth being direct in the verdict about what these scenes accomplish and where they fall short, because a review that only praises trains its audience not to trust its judgment later. The choreography throughout these early lessons is genuinely well constructed, favoring clean, readable technique over rapid, disorienting editing, which lets Michael Jai White's real martial arts background carry the scenes with a physical credibility a more heavily cut, effects-driven action sequence would not achieve. Where the film is weaker is in its dialogue during these same scenes, which frequently settles for functional, expository lines rather than lines that reveal character, a tension worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. Bryant explains technique clearly. He rarely says anything in these scenes that deepens what we understand about who he actually is underneath the technique, and the film is content to let the physical performance do emotional work the script itself does not always fully commit to doing through language. Oscar's transformation action across these training scenes is handled with more subtlety than the choreography around it, and it is worth tracking specifically what changes in him rather than simply noting that he improves. He does not simply get better at fighting. He visibly begins standing differently in scenes that have nothing to do with training at all, meeting adult conversations with more eye contact, absorbing Hector's continued overtures with more visible skepticism rather than passive drift. This is the character psychology worth sitting with directly. Oscar was never actually looking for violence or criminal belonging as an end in itself. He was looking for evidence that he mattered enough to someone for that someone to invest real time and real effort in him. And Bryant's training, however incidentally violent in its actual content, is functioning as exactly that evidence in a way nothing else currently available to Oscar in this town is managing to provide. Then the incident arrives that the entire back half of the film will be built around, and it is staged with a deliberately mundane, almost anticlimactic energy that makes its consequences land harder in retrospect. During a confrontation with some of Hector's crew, Oscar, now considerably more capable than he was at the film's opening, successfully defends himself using exactly the technique Bryant has spent weeks drilling into him. It should read, in the moment, as a clean, satisfying payoff of the mentorship story the film has been building. Instead, someone in the surrounding crowd films the entire exchange on a phone, and within hours the footage is circulating locally, then regionally, gaining exactly the kind of casual, algorithm-driven momentum short, dramatic fight clips reliably generate online regardless of who is actually in them or what consequences that visibility might carry for the people involved. This is the film's sharpest, most contemporary idea, and it deserves more credit than most reviews give it. The specific danger that eventually catches up to Bryant is not old-fashioned detective work, a rival tracking him patiently across years and countries. It is simply the ordinary, indifferent machinery of viral attention, entirely unconcerned with privacy, consequence, or who might be standing just out of frame with very good reasons to never be seen on camera again. Bryant's reaction to seeing that footage circulate is where Michael Jai White's performance does its most effective quiet work in this opening stretch of the film. There is no explosive confrontation with Oscar, no immediate lecture about the danger he has unknowingly created. Instead, the film holds on Bryant's face for several long seconds, watching him recalculate everything about his current, carefully constructed life in real time. And that stillness carries considerably more weight than a louder reaction would, because by this point the film has already trained you to recognize exactly how much effort this particular stillness usually requires from him. Somewhere, watching that same footage on a screen Bryant will never see, is someone from his old life who has clearly been waiting a very long time for exactly this kind of mistake. And the film ends its opening movement here, on the exact hinge point between the quiet life Bryant built and the violent one he thought he had permanently left behind, without yet telling you who is watching, or how much time Bryant actually has left before that answer arrives at his own front door. It's worth pausing on the specific choice to root Bryant's exposure in something this ordinary rather than in a more traditional thriller contrivance, because the film could easily have chosen a more conventional trigger, a chance encounter, a nosy neighbor, an old associate passing through town. Instead, it chooses a fight clip filmed by a stranger with no stake in Bryant's past whatsoever, uploaded for no reason more sinister than the same casual impulse that drives millions of people to film and share dramatic moments every day without thinking twice about who might be standing in the background. That banality is the entire point. Bryant did not survive years of careful discipline only to be undone by a rival's cunning. He was undone by an ordinary teenager's phone and the ordinary, indifferent momentum of the internet itself. And the film wants that specific irony sitting uncomfortably with you well before it ever explains exactly who Bryant used to be, or why that irony is about to cost him everything he has spent so long rebuilding. The video does not simply travel in the abstract. It lands, specifically and directly, on a screen belonging to Sonny Kilbane. And the moment this film finally reveals who Bryant actually is and who he used to work against is where the story's genre machinery clicks fully into place. Bryant was a police officer embedded deep enough inside Kilbane's criminal operation to gather the kind of evidence that ends careers and puts people away for a very long time. And when he finally testified, he did not simply damage Kilbane's organization. He gutted it publicly, on the record, in a way Kilbane has apparently spent years unable to forgive or move past. Witness protection gave Bryant a new name, a new country, and a new quiet life specifically designed to make him unfindable. It did not give him anonymity forever, and the film is careful to frame Kilbane's reaction to that fight video not as sudden rage, but as the arrival of an opportunity he has clearly been waiting waiting patiently for, the specific kind of patient, personal grudge that does not fade with time so much as sit quietly, indefinitely, for exactly the mistake that finally hands over a location. Tom Berenger plays Kilbane with a controlled, almost businesslike menace that deliberately avoids the louder, more theatrical villain energy this kind of role often invites, and that restraint is worth crediting specifically as a directorial and performance choice rather than simply accepting it as a byproduct of a lower-budget production. Kilbane does not rage when he sees the footage. He simply confirms, with quiet, practiced certainty, that the man in the video is exactly who he has been looking for, and begins making calls. This matters for how the film's antagonist functions structurally across the rest of the story. Kilbane is never framed as unpredictable or chaotic. He is framed as a man running a long-delayed, entirely rational business decision, which makes him a considerably more unsettling adversary than a hot-tempered one would be, precisely because nothing about his pursuit of Bryant reads as impulsive or reversible once it has actually begun. Back in the border town, Bryant is forced into the specific, agonizing calculation this kind of story exists to dramatize. Does he disappear again immediately, cutting off contact with Oscar and rebuilding an entirely new life somewhere else before Kilbane's people can arrive, or does he stay, knowing that staying almost certainly means the violence following him is about to land directly on top of the one person in this town who actually has come to depend on him? The film does not let this decision resolve quickly or easily, and it is worth naming exactly what makes Bryant's eventual choice to stay feel earned rather than simply convenient for the plot. He has spent the entire first act demonstrating, through action rather than dialogue, that mentorship is the one language of genuine care he still has access to. Abandoning Oscar now, at the exact moment Oscar needs steady adult presence more than ever, would mean abandoning the one meaningful relationship Bryant has allowed himself to build since going into hiding, and the film trusts the audience to understand that cost without needing a lengthy monologue to spell it out directly. Marisol, Oscar's older sister, becomes a considerably more important figure in this stretch of the film than her limited screen time in the opening act suggested she might be, and her presence sharpens the emotional stakes of Bryant's decision in a way worth naming specifically. She is skeptical of Bryant from early in the story, wary of a stranger with an unclear past taking this much interest in her younger brother, and that skepticism is never treated by the film as an obstacle to be simply charmed away. It is treated as reasonable, even correct, given what the audience already knows and Marisol does not. When Bryant finally begins revealing pieces of his real situation to her, out of necessity rather than trust freely given, the film uses her reaction as a kind of proxy for the audience's own recalibration of him. She is not simply falling for a mysterious, dangerous man in the conventional genre sense. She is doing the harder, more grounded work of deciding whether someone with this much violence in his past can actually be trusted with her family's safety going forward, and her continued presence in the story despite that danger functions as one of the film's more effective, understated demonstrations of Bryant's genuine character, delivered through someone else's judgment rather than his own self-assessment. Meanwhile, Hector's response to Oscar's viral fight is escalating in a direction considerably more dangerous than simple embarrassment. Oscar's public defeat of Hector's crew members has cost Hector real standing within his own organization, the kind of visible humiliation a man running a local criminal operation cannot simply absorb without consequence to his own authority. This gives the film two simultaneous, converging threats rather than one, and it is worth noting how carefully the structure keeps both threads independently dangerous rather than collapsing them into a single, simplified villain. Kilbane represents Bryant's old, distant past finally catching up to him. Hector represents an immediate, local consequence of Bryant's attempt to build something better in his new life. Both threats are now bearing down on the same small town, the same handful of people, at roughly the same time, and the film uses this convergence to strip away any easy path forward for Bryant, who can no longer simply run from one danger without walking directly into the other. Bryant's decision to prepare for a fight rather than flee is dramatized less through speeches and more through a shift in his physical behavior around the house he shares in the town, a shift the film trusts a genre-literate audience to read without needing it explained in dialogue. Locks get checked, routes in and out of the property get quietly reassessed. Old instincts, clearly dormant rather than gone, begin resurfacing in small, practical ways, and Michael Jai White plays this transition with the same physical discipline that defined his stillness earlier in the film, except now that discipline is visibly being redirected from concealment toward preparation. This is worth naming as a specific piece of character character craft, because it avoids the more common genre shortcut of simply having the protagonist announce his intentions out loud. You are meant to notice Bryant preparing for violence the same way you were earlier meant to notice him avoiding it, through behavior rather than declaration, and the film's confidence in that visual storytelling is one of its more consistently underrated strengths. Oscar, for his part, senses that something has shifted in Bryant without yet understanding the full scope of what he has unknowingly triggered, and the film handles this gap in knowledge with real sensitivity rather than simply using it for cheap dramatic irony. Oscar begins to ask more direct questions about Bryant's past, questions Bryant deflects with the same practiced ease he has presumably used for years, except now those deflections carry visible strain they did not carry before, small cracks in a mask that is otherwise held perfectly steady. This matters for the mentor relationship at the center of the film, because it introduces genuine tension into a bond that had, up to this point, been built almost entirely on trust flowing in one direction. Oscar has been open with Bryant about his grief, his frustrations, his temptation toward Hector's world. Bryant has offered him structure and discipline in return, but almost nothing resembling equivalent honesty about himself. And the film is quietly asking whether mentorship built this asymmetrically can actually hold once real danger, rather than simple guidance, becomes the thing at stake between them. There is a specific confrontation in this stretch of the film worth examining closely, where Hector, having lost standing within his own crew after Oscar's viral defeat of his men, escalates from recruitment pressure into direct intimidation, cornering Oscar without Bryant present in order to reassert control through fear rather than appeal. This scene works because it strips away the low-stakes friendliness that characterized Hector's earlier approach entirely, revealing the coercive foundation that was always sitting underneath his apparent warmth toward Oscar from the very beginning. It is worth naming this as a piece of character psychology rather than a simple plot escalation. Hector's authority within his own organization depends on being feared as much as being liked, and Oscar's public humiliation of his crew has directly threatened that authority in a way Hector cannot allow to stand unanswered, regardless of whatever genuine affection he may have actually felt toward the boy earlier in the story. The film does not ask you to fully disbelieve that earlier warmth was real. It asks you to notice how quickly warmth curdles into threat the moment a relationship this unequal in power stops serving the more powerful party's interests. Bryant learns about this confrontation after the fact, and his reaction marks the clearest turning point in his own arc across this act. Where his earlier caution was primarily about protecting his own concealment, his response here is unmistakably about protecting Oscar specifically, a shift the film signals through a subtle but deliberate change in Michael Jai White's body language. Less measured self-control now, more direct, focused urgency. This is the moment worth identifying as the emotional hinge of the entire film's back half. Bryant stops calculating his own risk primarily in terms of his own survival and starts calculating it primarily in terms of Oscar's safety, a shift that will directly shape every major decision he makes for the remainder of the story, including decisions that will require him to abandon the careful invisibility that kept him alive for years in favor of something considerably more exposed and considerably more dangerous. The act closes on a tense, quiet scene between Bryant and Marisol, where he finally tells her enough of the truth to explain the danger now bearing down on her brother, without yet giving her the full account of who Kilbane actually is or what Bryant did to earn this level of pursuit. This scene is doing careful narrative work worth naming directly. It gives the audience a controlled, incremental release of information that mirrors Marisol's own controlled, incremental extension of trust, rather than dumping Bryant's entire backstory in one expository monologue. She does not fully forgive him for the danger his presence has brought into her family's life, and the film does not ask her to. She simply decides, with visible reluctance, that removing Bryant from Oscar's life now would create more immediate danger than keeping him in it, a pragmatic rather than sentimental calculation that keeps her character considerably more grounded than a simpler, more forgiving version of this same scene would have allowed her to remain. There's a detail worth surfacing before this act closes, because it clarifies exactly what kind of danger Bryant is actually facing now that both threats have converged on the same small town. Kilbane's people are not simply arriving to intimidate or negotiate. Given what Bryant did to Kilbane's organization on the witness stand, and given how long Kilbane has apparently been waiting for exactly this opportunity, the film makes clear through Bryant's own preparations that whatever is coming is not designed to end in anything short of Bryant's death, and likely anyone standing close enough to him when it arrives. That stakes-raising detail is worth naming plainly rather than leaving implicit, because it means every remaining decision Bryant makes from this point forward, including his decision to keep Oscar and Marisol close rather than sending them away, carries real, specific risk to people who did nothing to earn that risk beyond the simple misfortune of caring about a man with this particular history. The film does not let you forget that cost, even as it builds toward the more conventional, satisfying confrontation its genre ultimately requires. Kilbane's men arrive in town with the same businesslike efficiency the film has already established as his defining quality, and it is worth noting how deliberately the film avoids turning their arrival into a loud, telegraphed spectacle. There is no dramatic entrance, no convoy of vehicles announcing itself down the main street. They arrive quietly, methodically, asking careful questions of the kind of people who would notice an American man who keeps to himself, and the film lets this reconnaissance phase play out with a patience that mirrors Kilbane's own character rather than rushing toward the action the genre eventually requires. This restraint matters for how the eventual violence lands, because it establishes that Bryant is not facing a chaotic, easily provoked threat he can simply outfight through raw aggression. He is facing a controlled, professional operation that has clearly done this kind of work before, which raises the stakes of the eventual confrontation considerably higher than a more conventional, hot-headed antagonist would manage to achieve on his own. Bryant, for his part, is not caught fully by surprise, and this matters for maintaining the competence the film has spent 2 acts establishing in him. He has been watching for exactly this kind of quiet reconnaissance since the footage first surfaced, and when Kilbane's men finally make contact, Bryant is already positioned with enough preparation to make the encounter a genuine contest rather than a one-sided ambush. This choice deserves specific credit as craft, because it would have been easy for a film in this genre to strip Bryant of his competence temporarily in order to manufacture more suspense, forcing him into a reactive, desperate posture purely for dramatic effect. Instead, the film trusts the tension it has already built through 2 acts of careful preparation and character work, letting Bryant meet this threat as the capable, disciplined man the story has consistently shown him to be, which makes the eventual violence feel like the payoff of everything established rather than a sudden, disconnected action sequence bolted onto the story's more thoughtful earlier stretches. The first real confrontation is staged in tight, controlled spaces rather than sprawling, open-action geography, and this choice reinforces something the film has been building visually since its opening scenes. Bryant's entire existence in this town has been about controlling small, contained spaces, keeping his world narrow and manageable specifically so nothing inside it can spiral beyond his control. Fighting Kilbane's men inside that same narrow, familiar geography, rather than in some more expansive, unfamiliar action movie setting, keeps the confrontation grounded in the specific stakes the film has spent 2 acts establishing rather than letting it become generic, interchangeable action spectacle. Michael Jai White's physical performance carries these sequences with the same discipline and clarity that defined the earlier training scenes, favoring readable, credible technique over the kind of rapid, disorienting editing that would undercut the sense of competence and control the character has embodied throughout. Hector's crew, meanwhile, chooses this exact moment of vulnerability to make their own move against Oscar, and the film's decision to let these 2 threats collide rather than resolve sequentially is one of its stronger structural choices, worth naming directly as a piece of plotting craft. With Bryant occupied defending against Kilbane's men, Oscar is left considerably more exposed to Hector's retaliation than he would otherwise be, and the film uses this convergence to force Oscar into a genuine test of everything Bryant has taught him, without Bryant physically present to intervene directly. This is where the mentorship arc the film has been building since its opening act pays off most directly, and it is worth being specific about what that payoff actually demonstrates. Oscar does not simply win a fight using borrowed technique. He makes a series of controlled, disciplined choices under real pressure, exactly the kind of decision-making Bryant has been quietly modeling for him since their first training session, proving that what Bryant actually gave him was never simply the ability to throw a punch, but the capacity to stay calm and think clearly inside a genuinely dangerous situation. Marisol's role in this stretch of the film deserves specific credit as well, because the script resists the common genre temptation to sideline her into a purely passive, endangered position once the action escalates. She takes active steps to protect Oscar and herself during Hector's approach, decisions that reflect the same grounded, pragmatic character the film established for her earlier through her cautious handling of Bryant's revelations. This matters for the film's overall character work, because it means the story's female lead remains an active participant in her own survival rather than becoming simply a stake for the male characters to fight over. however. A distinction worth naming plainly given how frequently genre films in this specific action thriller tradition fail to extend the same agency to their female characters that they extend automatically to their male leads. Bryant, having neutralized the immediate threat from Kilbane's advance team, moves directly toward Oscar's location once he learns of Hector's simultaneous attack, and the sequence connecting these two confrontations is where the film's pacing tightens most effectively across its entire runtime. There is no wasted transitional scene here, no extended dialogue slowing the momentum between one crisis and the next. The film trusts its audience to understand the urgency without needing it explained, cutting directly from Bryant securing his immediate surroundings to Bryant moving with clear, focused purpose toward the person he has spent 2 acts establishing as his actual priority. This structural efficiency is worth crediting specifically because it demonstrates a confidence in visual storytelling that the film's occasionally functional dialogue does not always match, letting momentum and clear geography carry the tension rather than leaning on additional lines of explanation. The confrontation between Bryant and Hector, when it finally arrives, is staged with a different emotional register than the earlier fight against Kilbane's professional operatives, and that distinction is worth naming directly as a piece of craft. Where the fight against Kilbane's men played as controlled, almost procedural competence against competence, the confrontation with Hector carries genuine personal stakes on both sides. Hector is not simply protecting territory or reasserting organizational authority anymore. He has been publicly humiliated by a teenager he spent months attempting to recruit, and Bryant is not simply neutralizing a professional threat. He is directly protecting someone he has come to genuinely care about, and the fight choreography reflects that heightened personal stake through slightly less controlled, more urgent physicality than the cleaner, more technical sequences earlier in the film. This shift is a deliberate choice worth naming rather than a simple inconsistency in the choreography, because it visually communicates the difference between professional violence and personal violence without needing a single line of dialogue to make the distinction explicit. Oscar's own contribution to this confrontation deserves specific attention because the film resists the easy temptation to have him simply stand aside once Bryant arrives to handle the more dangerous elements of the fight directly. Instead, Oscar remains an active participant, using exactly the discipline and technique Bryant spent the film's opening act instilling in him, and this choice matters considerably for how the mentorship arc ultimately resolves. If Bryant had simply arrived to rescue Oscar outright, sidelining him the moment real danger appeared, the entire training relationship established across the first 2 acts would read, in retrospect, as narrative preparation for a rescue. Oscar was never actually meant to participate in himself. Instead, the film lets Oscar fight alongside Bryant as a genuine, if junior, partner in his own defense, which retroactively validates every training scene that came before it as something considerably more meaningful than simple foreshadowing for a moment Oscar would ultimately be excluded from. Hector's defeat, when it comes, is handled with a restraint worth noting specifically because the film resists framing it as a simple, triumphant knockout blow delivering easy catharsis. There is a weight to the final exchange between Bryant and Hector that reflects everything the film has established about both men's respective relationships to Oscar, the mentor who offered genuine structure against the recruiter who offered structure wrapped around coercion and control. The fight ends decisively, but the film does not linger on triumph in its aftermath, moving quickly instead toward the more pressing, unresolved threat still bearing down on all of them from Kilbane's larger operation, a structural choice that keeps the film's stakes properly ordered even in its most conventionally satisfying action beat. With the immediate local threat from Hector resolved, the film pivots directly toward its final confrontation with Kilbane himself, and it is worth noting how the story handles this transition without allowing the audience a genuine moment of relief before escalating further. Kilbane, learning that his advance team has failed to secure Bryant, does not retreat or reconsider his approach. He commits further, arriving personally rather than continuing to work exclusively through intermediaries, a choice that reflects Tom Berenger's earlier established characterization of Kilbane as a man driven by patient, personal grievance rather than simple professional obligation. This is worth naming directly as consistent character logic rather than a convenient plot escalation. A man who has waited this many years for exactly this opportunity was never going to delegate its resolution entirely to subordinates once his first attempt failed, and his personal arrival raises the stakes of the film's climax considerably by making the final confrontation directly unambiguously personal for both men involved rather than simply another exchange between Bryant and a rotating cast of high retired operatives. The final confrontation between Bryant and Kilbane is staged with a clarity of purpose that pulls together everything the film has established across its runtime, and it deserves credit for resisting the temptation to overcomplicate its climax with unnecessary additional twists or last-minute reversals. This is simply the collision the entire story has been building toward from its opening minutes. The man who testified against everything Kilbane built finally facing the consequences of that testimony directly, without intermediaries, without the safety of distance and anonymity that witness protection was originally designed to provide. The film lets this confrontation carry the full emotional weight of Bryant's entire backstory, delivered not through additional expository dialogue, but through the simple, direct physicality of two men whose entire conflict has been years in the making finally resolving itself in the same kind of contained, personal space the film has favored throughout its more grounded action sequences. Bryant ultimately overcomes Kilbane, and it's worth being specific about how the film handles this resolution rather than simply noting that the protagonist wins. The victory is not staged as an easy or clean triumph. It costs Bryant visibly, physically, in a way that reflects the real, accumulated toll of everything he has fought through across this single, extended confrontation, and the film resists giving him an untouched, effortless win that would undercut the genuine danger Kilbane has represented throughout the story. Kilbane's defeat closes out the specific, personal grievance that has driven the film's central threat, but the film is careful not to suggest that this single confrontation magically resolves every consequence of Bryant's exposure. His identity has still been compromised. The video that started this entire chain of events still exists, still circulated, still theoretically visible to anyone else out there who might recognize him the same way Kilbane's people eventually did. The film lets that lingering uncertainty sit alongside the immediate, resolved threat, refusing to pretend that defeating one specific enemy fully undoes the broader exposure that made this entire confrontation possible in the first place. In its final minutes, the film shows Bryant, bruised and clearly exhausted, standing over the resolved wreckage of both threats that converged on this small town, with Oscar and Marisol both alive and both, in different ways, permanently changed by what they have just witnessed him become. Kilbane's specific personal grievance has been settled. Hector's grip on Oscar has been broken, but the film resists closing on a purely triumphant note, choosing instead to linger on the practical, unresolved cost of everything that has happened. The video still exists. Bryant's face and location have already circulated once and could theoretically circulate again, and the quiet, invisible life he spent years carefully building has been permanently altered by the simple fact of having been seen. That is the resolution in its barest mechanical form, and it matters because the film is not primarily interested in whether Bryant survives his enemies. It is interested in whether a man built entirely around disappearing can actually keep living once disappearing is no longer fully available to him. Here is the specific reading worth arguing for directly. Bryant's arc across this film is not really about defeating Kilbane, satisfying as that confrontation is staged to be. It is about the slow, reluctant reconstruction of a man who has spent years defining safety purely as invisibility, forced by circumstance into discovering that a different kind of safety, built around genuine relationships rather than pure concealment, might actually serve him better going forward. Everything Bryant does across the film's back half, staying rather than fleeing, revealing pieces of his truth to Marisol, fighting to protect Oscar rather than simply protecting his own cover, represents a man choosing connection over concealment for what appears to be the first time since he entered witness protection. The film does not frame this choice as naive or reckless, even though it directly costs him the anonymity that once kept him alive. It frames it as the harder, more honest way to actually live, rather than merely survive. And that distinction between surviving and living is the quiet emotional argument sitting underneath all of the film's more conventional genre mechanics. The film's central theme follows directly from that reading. Genuine safety was never actually available to Bryant through isolation alone, no matter how carefully constructed or how many years he maintained it. Isolation kept him alive, but it did not give him anything resembling an actual life. And the film argues, through Oscar and Marisol's presence in his final scenes, that the specific vulnerability of caring about other people, the exact vulnerability Bryant spent years avoiding, is ultimately what gives his survival any meaning worth having. A second, quieter theme runs underneath the first. The film is genuinely interested in what mentorship actually requires beyond simple technical instruction. Bryant did not save Oscar by teaching him to fight. He saved him by giving him consistent, reliable adult presence at the exact moment his life was most likely to tip toward genuine danger, and the fighting technique itself was always simply the vehicle carrying that more important, harder-to-articulate gift. Now the verdict, delivered directly rather than softened for the sake of easy praise. As Good as Dead succeeds most clearly as a genre exercise, delivering competent, well-choreographed action sequences anchored by a performance from Michael Jai White that carries real physical credibility and more emotional restraint than this kind of role typically receives. Tom Berenger's Kilbane is effectively unsettling specifically because of how little he needs to raise his voice to communicate real menace. Where the film is genuinely weaker, and this deserves to be stated plainly rather than glossed over, is in its dialogue and its pacing during the connective tissue between action sequences, where exposition sometimes substitutes for character development rather than deepening it, and where certain plot mechanics, particularly around exactly how quickly and completely the viral video travels from a small border town directly into Kilbane's specific field of vision, ask the audience to accept convenient narrative speed over fully earned plausibility. This is a legitimate structural weakness worth naming specifically rather than waving away as a minor genre convention, because a film built around the sharp, contemporary idea of viral exposure deserves a version of that mechanism with slightly more texture than a single, unexplained leap from local footage to a specific crime boss's personal attention. This is a film for viewers who appreciate grounded, character-driven action over spectacle-heavy blockbuster filmmaking, and who are drawn specifically to mentor-protege stories that treat the mentorship itself as seriously as the action it eventually enables. It rewards viewers with some patience for slower opening act, since the film's emotional foundation depends on that setup landing before its action-driven back half can carry real weight. It is not a film for viewers seeking a purely escapist, high-spectacle action experience, since its scale remains intentionally modest and grounded throughout, and its most memorable moments come from character rather than scale. It's worth pausing on the film's title itself before closing out, because As Good as Dead is doing more thematic work than a simple action movie tagline might initially suggest. The phrase describes someone whose situation is so precarious that survival itself seems functionally impossible, and the film applies that phrase to Bryant on at least two overlapping levels worth separating out directly. On the surface level, it describes his literal physical danger once Kilbane identifies him. A man who testified against a crime organization typically does not survive being found by the people he testified against. But the title also describes something quieter and more psychological. A man living entirely in hiding, refusing every genuine connection that might expose him, is in a real sense already as good as dead long before Kilbane ever enters the picture, present in body, but withholding himself from anything resembling an actual life. Read this way, the film's climax is not simply about Bryant surviving Kilbane's attempt to kill him. It is about Bryant choosing to stop being as good as dead in the quieter, earlier sense, well before the more literal, physical version of that threat ever arrives at his door. Oscar's arc deserves one final piece of specific attention before this closes, because his transformation across the film represents something the story handles with more nuance than a simple before and after redemption structure might suggest. He does not simply become a better fighter. He becomes someone capable of making disciplined choices under pressure, someone who chooses, in the film's final act, to actively participate in protecting the people he cares about rather than remaining a passive figure others must protect on his behalf. This distinction matters for how the mentorship theme ultimately resolves, because it means Bryant's gift to Oscar was never really about violence at all, despite the genre's obvious fixation on physical combat as its primary vehicle. It was about giving a grieving, drifting teenager a structure sturdy enough to build real agency on top of, agency that ultimately manifests as much in his steadier presence and clearer judgment as it does in his physical capability during the film's action sequences. Marisol's arc, though given less screen time than either Bryant's or Oscar's, closes on a note worth naming specifically, because her final position in the story reflects the same grounded pragmatism the film established for her from her first appearance. She does not end the film as a simple romantic reward for Bryant's heroism, nor does she end it having fully resolved her earlier wariness about the danger his presence brought into her family's life. She ends it having made a considered, adult judgment that the value Bryant provides, both to her brother and, implicitly, to her own life, outweighs the risk that judgment requires her to continue accepting. This is a more mature resolution than many films in this genre bother to offer their female leads, and it deserves specific credit for resisting the easier, more sentimental version of this same ending that a less disciplined script might have reached for instead. It's worth placing this film honestly within its own own genre lineage before offering a final thought, because doing so clarifies exactly what kind of achievement this movie actually represents. As Good as Dead sits comfortably within a long tradition of grounded, modestly budgeted action thrillers built around a single central performer's physical credibility, a tradition that has produced everything from quieter, character-driven martial arts films to considerably more disposable direct-to-streaming genre exercises. This film lands closer to the former end of that spectrum than the latter, precisely because of the genuine care it takes with its mentorship relationship and its willingness to let quieter, more character-focused scenes breathe before escalating into its action set pieces. It does not entirely transcend its genre's more familiar rhythms and occasional narrative shortcuts, but it executes those familiar rhythms with more craft and more genuine emotional investment than a large portion of its direct competition in the same modest budget action space. And that consistency across a film built on this scale is itself a meaningful accomplishment worth recognizing directly. There is also a broader real-world resonance worth naming before this analysis closes, because the film's central premise, however heightened by genre convention, taps into something increasingly familiar to anyone living with a smartphone in their pocket. Bryant's exposure was not the result of a targeted investigation or a determined enemy tracking him down through patient detective work. It was the result of an ordinary act, a stranger filming a dramatic moment and sharing it without any awareness of who might be standing in that footage or what consequences that visibility might carry for them. Most people watching this film will never have testified against a crime organization or entered witness protection, but nearly everyone watching has, in some smaller way, experienced the specific modern anxiety of being captured on someone else's camera without consent, uploaded into a system with no meaningful control over where that footage travels or who eventually sees it. The film's premise is heightened for genre purposes, but the underlying vulnerability it dramatizes is considerably more ordinary and more widely shared than the specific circumstances of Bryant's past might initially suggest. This also clarifies something worth stating plainly about how the film positions its villain relative to its actual thematic target. Kilbane is a satisfying, credible genre antagonist, but he is not really the film's deepest source of danger when you step back from the plot mechanics themselves. The deeper danger the film is quietly gesturing toward is the same one running underneath its central irony. A world where visibility itself has become almost impossible to fully control, where a single unplanned moment captured by a stranger can travel further and faster than any individual's ability to manage the consequences that follow. Bryant spent years building a life specifically designed to resist this exact kind of exposure, and the film's real, quiet argument is that in a world saturated with cameras and instant sharing, that kind of total control over your own visibility may no longer be genuinely achievable for anyone, regardless of how disciplined or careful they remain. If there is one thought worth carrying out of this film, it might be this: the safest version of a life is rarely the same thing as the most livable version of one, and the specific courage this story asks its protagonist to find is not the courage to fight, which he already had in abundance before the story even begins, but the harder, quieter courage to be seen again by people worth being seen by, even after everything he learned about how dangerous being seen can actually turn out to be. There is a visual and thematic idea running underneath this entire film that rarely gets more than a passing mention in casual coverage, and it starts with the setting itself. The story unfolds almost entirely in a Mexican border town, a specific kind of liminal geography that exists neither fully inside nor fully outside the country Bryant is actually hiding from, and that choice of location is doing considerably more symbolic work than simple production convenience. Border towns occupy a genuinely unusual cultural and legal position, close enough to danger to remain permeable, far enough from full oversight to remain genuinely obscure, and Bryant's decision to build his hidden life in exactly this kind of space reflects something specific about his own psychology that the film never states outright. He has not chosen total isolation in some remote, empty wilderness. He has chosen a populated, layered, in-between place, close enough to danger that hiding here requires constant vigilance, but populated enough that a careful, disciplined man can still blend into its rhythms without drawing unwanted attention. The border itself becomes a quiet visual echo of Bryant's entire existence throughout the film, a man permanently positioned between two identities, two lives, two versions of himself, never fully able to settle on either side of that line until the story's climax finally forces the decision on him directly. It's worth examining the film's visual palette with the same close attention this analysis has already given to its setting, stunning, because the color and lighting choices reinforce this same liminal, in-between quality throughout the story's quieter scenes. The town itself is shot with warm, dusty, sun-worn tones during the daytime training sequences between Bryant and Oscar, a visual register that reads as lived-in and grounded rather than glamorous, appropriate for a story more interested in character than spectacle. This warmth shifts noticeably during the film's tenser confrontation scenes, where shadows deepen and the color temperature cools considerably, a fairly conventional genre technique on its own, but one that gains extra resonance here specifically because it mirrors the emotional shift Bryant himself undergoes across the story, from the warm, cultivated ordinariness of his hidden life toward the colder, more familiar violence of the life he thought he had permanently left behind. Michael Jai White's performance deserves closer, more specific attention than the broad, physical credibility praise most reviews settle for, because the actual craft of his performance lies as much in what he withholds as in what he demonstrates through action. His background as a genuine martial artist gives the fight choreography real, tangible weight, but the more interesting performance choice sits in his quieter scenes, particularly in how carefully he calibrates Bryant's warmth toward Oscar against a persistent, low-level watchfulness that never fully disappears even in the film's gentlest moments. Watch his eyes specifically during the early training scenes, which remain in near constant, almost unconscious motion, tracking exits, tracking strangers at the edge of frame, tracking anything that might represent a threat, even while his voice and his teaching remain patient and warm. This is a considerably more disciplined piece of physical acting than the genre typically demands or receives credit for, communicating Bryant's entire hidden history through sustained behavioral detail rather than dialogue or exposition. Tom Berenger's performance as Kilbane rewards similar close attention, particularly in how he handles the character's controlled stillness across scenes that could easily have tipped into more conventional, raised-voice villain theatrics. Berenger plays Kilbane's menace almost entirely through pacing rather than volume, letting silences stretch slightly longer than a scene technically requires, letting simple, quiet statements carry more weight through unhurried delivery than a more aggressive reading would achieve. This restraint pays off specifically because it distinguishes Kilbane from the more disposable, interchangeable antagonists that populate a large portion of this genre's lower-budget output, giving the film's central threat a specific, memorable texture that elevates the eventual confrontation with Bryant beyond simple genre obligation. It's worth placing this film honestly within the broader career context of its lead performer, because that context sharpens what this specific role represents within a larger body of work. Michael Jai White has spent much of his career working within exactly this kind of modestly budgeted action filmmaking, frequently carrying films built around his specific combination of genuine martial arts credibility and an understated, controlled screen presence that distinguishes him from the more overtly theatrical action stars this genre has historically favored. As Good as Dead fits comfortably within that broader body of work, giving him a role that leans specifically into his strengths as a performer capable of communicating restraint and quiet emotional weight alongside his more obvious physical capability, rather than simply asking him to serve as a vehicle for action choreography without deeper character texture attached to it. There is a smaller structural detail worth surfacing about how the film handles Bryant's backstory that most coverage skips past entirely, and it concerns the specific pacing of information the audience receives about his past. The film does not deliver Bryant's full history in one clean expository scene, choosing instead to reveal it gradually, in fragments, mirroring the same incremental trust-building process happening between Bryant and Marisol within the story itself. This choice keeps the audience positioned similarly to Marisol throughout much of the film, gradually assembling a fuller picture of who Bryant actually is from partial, carefully rationed information, rather than being granted the more complete, privileged knowledge a traditional flashback sequence would typically provide. It is a modest but genuinely effective structural choice, and it deserves credit for trusting the audience to piece together Bryant's situation through implication and context rather than requiring a single, heavy-handed scene to explain everything at once. The film's treatment of Hector also rewards a second look with these craft observations in mind, because his character occupies a genuinely interesting middle position between sympathetic and purely villainous that the story never fully resolves in either direction. Hector is never given a redemption arc, and the film does not ask you to forgive his coercive treatment of Oscar once his warmth curdles into threat, but it also never strips him of the specific, grounded human motivations that made his earlier overtures toward Oscar feel plausible rather than cartoonish in the first place. He is a man operating within in a limited set of options in a town that offers few legitimate paths to the kind of authority and respect he clearly craves, and the film's willingness to let that context exist alongside his genuine culpability for the coercion and threat he directs toward Oscar gives him more dimension than the genre's more disposable antagonists typically receive. Even while the story never asks you to root for him or excuse what he ultimately does, it's worth addressing directly a criticism some viewers have reasonably raised about this film's handling of its border town setting and its Mexican characters, because engaging with that critique honestly matters more than defensively dismissing it. Some viewers have noted that the film's Central American protagonist arrives in this community as an outsider who nonetheless becomes its most capable protector, a familiar genre pattern with a long, sometimes uncomfortable history of positioning white or American characters as saviors within communities the story otherwise treats as backdrop rather than fully realized on their own terms. This film complicates that pattern somewhat by giving Oscar and Marisol genuine interiority and meaningful agency within their own story rather than reducing them purely to figures Bryant rescues. But it does not entirely escape the broader structural pattern the criticism identifies, since the story's central danger and its central resolution both still ultimately run primarily through Bryant's specific skill set and specific history rather than through the community's own existing resources or resilience. This tension is worth naming honestly as part of a complete critical picture of the film, rather than being either ignored entirely or treated as an automatic disqualifier for the film's other genuine strengths. There is also a worthwhile comparison to draw between this film and the broader tradition of witness protection stories in American film and television, because as Good as Dead engages with that premise somewhat differently than its most familiar predecessors typically do, where many witness protection narratives focus primarily on the bureaucratic machinery of the program itself, the handlers, the paperwork, the institutional systems designed to keep a witness safe. This film is almost entirely uninterested in that institutional apparatus once its premise has been established. Bryant is functionally alone, without visible support from whatever system originally relocated him, which shifts the story's actual interest away from institutional protection and toward personal, individual resilience and the specific relationships a person builds for themselves once official protection effectively recedes from view. This choice keeps the film's focus tightly on Bryant's individual psychology and his chosen relationships rather than diffusing attention across a larger institutional narrative, a deliberate narrowing worth naming as a genre choice rather than simply an oversight in the world building. Before this section closes, it's worth returning briefly to the film's pacing structure as a whole, because the balance between its quieter character work and its action sequences reflects a specific, deliberate strategy worth naming directly rather than simply describing as competent genre filmmaking. The film consistently earns its action through character setup rather than treating action as a periodic obligation the story must fulfill regardless of dramatic justification. Every major confrontation in this story is directly connected to a specific relationship or a specific piece of established character psychology. Bryant's care for Oscar, Kilbane's patient grievance, Hector's threatened authority, rather than functioning as interchangeable spectacle that could be relocated to any point in the story without losing meaning. This consistency across a modestly budgeted production is a genuine structural strength worth crediting specifically, even alongside the film's acknowledged weaknesses in dialogue and certain plot mechanics discussed earlier. There's one last comparative point worth raising before moving toward this analysis's closing sections, because it places As Good as Dead usefully alongside the specific mentorship subgenre it belongs to rather than treating it purely as a standalone action vehicle. Films built around a skilled, isolated adult training a vulnerable younger character share a recurring structural logic worth naming directly. The training itself functions as a vehicle for emotional repair on both sides of the relationship, not simply as preparation for an eventual physical confrontation. Bryant is not only equipping Oscar to survive, he is, almost certainly without fully recognizing it himself, working through his own isolation and his own long-suppressed need for genuine connection by allowing himself to matter to someone again. This film handles that dual function with more consistency than many entries in the same broad tradition, keeping both halves of that exchange, what Oscar gains and what Bryant quietly gains in return, visible throughout the story rather than letting the mentor's own emotional arc disappear entirely behind the more visible, external plot mechanics of the danger closing in around them. It's also worth noting how the film handles Bryant's physical vulnerability across its runtime, resisting the temptation to present him as an an invincible action figure immune to real consequence. He takes visible damage across the story's confrontations, moves with visible fatigue by the time Kilbane's final confrontation arrives, and the film lets that accumulated physical cost register on screen rather than resetting him to full capability between action beats. This grounds the film's action within something closer to plausible human limitation than the more heightened, consequence-free spectacle common to higher-budget entries in the genre, and it reinforces the story's broader emotional argument that survival here comes at a real, visible cost rather than arriving easily or cheaply for a man skilled enough to simply outmatch every threat without difficulty. There is a genuinely useful comparison to draw between this film and A History of Violence, because both stories share a core premise worth placing side by side. A man who has successfully buried a violent past beneath a quiet, ordinary new life, only to have that past resurface through a single, uncontrollable act of exposure. Where A History of Violence uses a local news report identifying its protagonist after a defensive act of violence in his own diner. As Good as Dead updates that same basic mechanism for a considerably more contemporary media environment, replacing a local news broadcast with a viral phone video circulating through algorithm-driven social sharing. This comparison matters because it clarifies exactly what kind of story this film is actually telling underneath its more straightforward action thriller packaging. Both films are fundamentally interested in the same anxiety, that a carefully rebuilt identity can be undone not by a determined enemy's investigation, but by the simple, indifferent mechanics of modern visibility, which makes no distinction between a private citizen's ordinary life and the specific danger that visibility might reintroduce into it. It's worth being direct about where this comparison also reveals a meaningful difference in ambition and execution between the two films, because an honest critical accounting requires naming that gap rather than letting the comparison flatter this film by association alone. A History of Violence uses its exposure premise to interrogate deeper, more uncomfortable questions about identity, capacity for violence, and whether a person can genuinely become someone different from who they once were, sustaining that inquiry across nuanced family relationships explored with considerable psychological depth. As Good as Dead engages with similar territory, but resolves it more straightforwardly, prioritizing genre satisfaction and a more conventional mentor-protege emotional arc over the kind of sustained ambiguity its more prestigious genre cousin maintains through its own ending. This is not a failure specific to this film so much as a reflection of its more modest genre ambitions and budget, but the comparison usefully clarifies exactly where this film sits on the spectrum between pure genre exercise and more literary, psychologically ambiguous crime drama. Luca Oriol's performance as Oscar deserves specific, dedicated attention that most coverage of this film skips past in favor of focusing almost entirely on the more established stars surrounding him. Playing a grieving teenager drawn toward criminal belonging requires a specific kind of controlled vulnerability, avoiding both overplayed melodrama and unconvincing stoicism, and Oriol largely threads that needle successfully across the film's quieter character scenes. His most effective moments arrive not during the film's action sequences, where his physicality reads as competent but understandably less refined than his more experienced co-star, but in smaller behavioral details during the earlier training scenes, specifically in how he modulates his openness toward Bryant across the film's first act, guarded at first, then gradually, believably more trusting as the mentorship deepens. This performance arc mirrors and supports the film's broader thematic interest in earned trust rather than instant connection, giving the central relationship a believable emotional foundation that the film's occasionally functional dialogue does not always fully carry on its own. There's a specific moral dilemma worth raising directly about Bryant's choice to train Oscar in the first place, one that most casual coverage of this film glosses over in favor of simply celebrating the mentorship as an unambiguous good. Bryant is, by his own established history, an extremely dangerous man, someone whose entire past involved deep infiltration into violent criminal activity, and his solution to Oscar's vulnerability toward gang recruitment is to teach a grieving teenager how to fight with real, damaging skill. Is that actually the right response to a kid at risk, or is it simply the only response available to a man whose entire emotional vocabulary runs through physical discipline rather than through more conventional forms of guidance, counseling, or support that might have addressed Oscar's underlying grief and loneliness more directly? The film does not force you to choose an answer, and it is worth sitting with the discomfort of that ambiguity rather than resolving it too quickly in Bryant's favor simply because his intentions are clearly good and the story story ultimately validates his approach through Oscar's eventual survival. The film's treatment of grief throughout its runtime also deserves more direct attention than the plot mechanics alone typically receive in coverage, because Oscar's loss of his mother functions as the actual emotional engine underneath everything else the story dramatizes. Every choice Oscar makes across the film, his initial drift toward Hector's gang, his eager response to Bryant's structured attention, his eventual willingness to fight alongside Bryant rather than simply be protected by him, traces back to the same underlying need: a grieving teenager searching for some form of stable adult presence and purpose to organize his life around after losing the person who previously provided both. The film never treats this grief as fully resolved by the story's end, and that restraint is worth crediting specifically. Bryant's mentorship gives Oscar structure and safety, but it does not undo his loss, and the film seems aware enough of that distinction to avoid suggesting that martial arts training and a found father figure can simply substitute for the specific, irreplaceable relationship Oscar actually lost. There's also a useful angle worth raising about the specific mechanics of how the viral video functions within this story, because it rewards closer scrutiny than a single passing mention earlier in this analysis provided. The video does not simply expose Bryant's location. It exposes his specific, distinctive fighting style, the exact techniques he learned and practiced during his original career, techniques distinctive enough that someone familiar with his history could plausibly recognize them even without seeing his face clearly in the footage. This detail matters because it means Bryant's exposure was not purely random bad luck. It was, in a sense, self-inflicted through the very act of generosity that defined his relationship with Oscar, teaching a specific, identifiable skill set that eventually became the exact signature that gave him away. This is a sharper piece of irony than the film's marketing or most casual coverage tends to emphasize, and it deserves recognition specifically because it ties Bryant's downfall directly back to his own choice to invest in Oscar rather than treating his exposure as simple, arbitrary misfortune unconnected to his own actions. It's worth pausing on what this specific mechanism implies about mentorship and legacy more broadly, because it complicates the film's otherwise fairly straightforward endorsement of Bryant's choice to train Oscar in the first place. Everything we teach someone else inevitably becomes visible through them, carried forward into situations we cannot fully control or predict, and Bryant's specific technique, once taught, was never going to remain fully contained within the private, controlled space of their training sessions. The moment Oscar used it in public, under pressure, in a genuinely dangerous situation, that knowledge became visible in a way Bryant could not take back or control, mirroring on a smaller, more personal scale the exact same anxiety the film's broader viral exposure premise dramatizes at a larger scale. What we give away, whether skill, knowledge, or simply visible presence in someone else's life, eventually travels beyond our ability to fully manage where it goes or what consequences it might eventually generate. There is also a worthwhile point to raise about the film's handling of pacing during its middle stretch, an area worth naming honestly as a mild structural weakness rather than glossing over it entirely in favor of the film's more successful elements. The transition between the mentorship building scenes of the opening act and the escalating danger of the middle act occasionally feels compressed, with certain plot beats, particularly around exactly how quickly Kilbane's organization identifies and locates Bryant once the video begins circulating, moving forward with a speed that prioritizes narrative momentum over fully earned plausibility. A slightly more patient middle stretch, allowing the investigation and discovery process a bit more room to breathe, might have strengthened the film's overall sense of escalating dread rather than compressing that tension into a somewhat abrupt narrative leap. This is a relatively minor criticism within the context of the film's overall competence, but it is worth naming specifically as part of an honest, complete assessment rather than omitting it in favor of a purely favorable account. The film's final shot deserves specific, close attention before this section closes, because it distills the story's central emotional argument into a single, relatively quiet image rather than closing on spectacle. Bryant, Oscar, and Marisol are shown together in the aftermath, not triumphant so much as simply present with each other, a family unit built not through blood, but through shared danger and chosen commitment. This closing image matters because it visually confirms the film's thematic argument about connection over isolation without needing a closing line of dialogue to state it explicitly. The camera does not linger on the defeated threats or the physical aftermath of violence. It lingers on the three people who chose, at real cost and real risk, to remain connected to each other rather than retreating into separate, safer isolation, which is precisely precisely the emotional resolution the film has been building toward since its earliest, quietest scenes of Bryant's careful, solitary routine. Before moving toward this analysis's final sections, it's worth stating directly what separates this film from the more disposable end of its genre spectrum, because that distinction is ultimately the argument for spending this much analytical attention on a modestly budgeted action thriller in the first place. A weaker version of this same premise would treat the mentorship simply as connective tissue between action sequences, existing purely to justify the training montage the genre expects. This film, whatever its structural imperfections, treats that mentorship as the actual emotional center of the story, with the action sequences functioning as tests and expressions of that relationship rather than the reverse. That prioritization, even when imperfectly executed in certain stretches of dialogue and pacing, is what elevates this specific film above the more interchangeable, purely mechanical entries that otherwise crowd this same modestly budgeted corner of the action thriller genre. There is one more comparative thought worth leaving here before closing this section out, because it clarifies why this film's specific combination of familiar genre elements manages to feel more coherent than a simple checklist of action thriller ingredients might suggest. Mentor stories, witness protection stories, and border town crime stories all carry their own well-worn conventions, and a lesser film could easily have stacked these three familiar frameworks together without finding the connective thread that makes them function as one coherent story rather than three loosely related ideas competing for attention. As Good as Dead succeeds specifically because it identifies the single emotional through line running underneath all three frameworks at once: the cost and the necessity of being truly seen by another person, whether that visibility arrives through a mentor finally trusting a protege with real training, through a witness protection subject finally trusting a new community enough to let his guard down, or through a fugitive's past finally, unavoidably catching up with the quiet present he tried to build for himself. Every genre element the film borrows ultimately serves that same underlying idea, which is what keeps the film feeling like a single, purposeful story rather than a patchwork of familiar, disconnected genre beats stitched together for the sake of runtime. There is a specific ethical question worth raising directly about Bryant's approach to resolving both threats bearing down on him, because the film's genre conventions tend to obscure a genuinely uncomfortable choice sitting underneath its more satisfying action beats. At no point does Bryant seriously attempt to contact law enforcement, immigration authorities, or whatever remains of the witness protection apparatus that originally relocated him, despite facing an organized crime figure with the resources and intent to kill him. He resolves both threats entirely through personal violence, a choice the film treats as simply the natural, expected shape of this genre rather than as a decision worth interrogating on its own terms. This is worth naming directly rather than accepting uncritically, because it reflects a recurring assumption in this specific strand of action filmmaking, that institutional systems, whether police, courts, or witness protection programs, are either unavailable, untrustworthy, or simply beside the point once a story's stakes become sufficiently personal. Bryant's specific history as a former police officer makes this absence particularly worth noting, since he of all people would presumably understand exactly how these institutional systems function and exactly why he might reasonably distrust them to protect him effectively this time. That absence becomes considerably more interesting once you consider it alongside Bryant's own professional background rather than simply accepting it as a convenient genre omission. A former officer choosing personal violence over institutional recourse implies something specific about his own view of those institutions, shaped presumably by his own direct experience within them, testifying against Kilbane through exactly the kind of formal, institutional process that was supposed to guarantee his safety permanently and ultimately did not. Read this way, Bryant's choice to handle both threats personally is not simply genre convention asserting itself over plausibility. It is a quiet, unstated argument about the limits of institutional protection built directly into the character's own history. A man who trusted the system once, watched that system's protections prove porous enough for Kilbane to eventually find him anyway, and has apparently concluded that his own direct capability is a more reliable safeguard than whatever official process originally promised to keep him safe. It's worth situating this film's border town setting within its broader real-world context as well, because the choice to place this story specifically along the US-Mexico border carries cultural and political resonance the film itself never directly addresses, but which an attentive viewer will likely register regardless. Border regions occupy a genuinely fraught position in contemporary American politics political discourse, frequently depicted in media either as sites of chaotic danger requiring forceful intervention or as backdrops largely stripped of their own independent identity in service of stories primarily concerned with American protagonists passing through them. This film's treatment sits closer to the more grounded, community-focused end of that spectrum than the more sensationalized alternative, giving its Mexican setting and its Mexican characters genuine stakes and genuine interiority rather than reducing the location purely to atmospheric danger. That said, as noted earlier in this analysis, the story's central resolution still ultimately depends on an American protagonist's specific skill set rather than on resources or resilience originating from within the community itself, a tension worth holding alongside the film's genuine strengths in this area, rather than resolving too neatly in either direction. The film's sound design and score deserve brief, specific attention as well, because the audio choices reinforce the story's central tension between quiet and violence in ways that complement its visual strategy discussed earlier in this analysis. The training and mentorship scenes are scored with restraint, favoring simple, understated musical cues that support rather than dictate the emotional register of these quieter moments. The action sequences shift toward a more percussive, rhythmically driven sound design, emphasizing the physical impact of the fight choreography over a more conventionally bombastic action score. This restraint across both registers keeps the film's sound design consistent with its broader visual and performance choices, favoring grounded, credible impact over the more heightened, stylized scoring that a larger budget entry in this genre might have reached for instead. And it is a modest but consistent piece of craft worth crediting specifically rather than assuming it as simply a budget constraint rather than a genuine aesthetic choice. Here's a question worth sitting with directly rather than resolving for you. Was Bryant's decision to train Oscar ultimately the right one, given everything it eventually cost? Or would Oscar have been genuinely safer if Bryant had simply kept his distance, protecting his own concealment rather than risking exposure through investment in someone else's life? Some viewers will argue unambiguously yes, pointing to Oscar's eventual survival and his demonstrated growth in confidence, discipline, and agency as clear vindication of Bryant's choice regardless of the danger it also introduced. Others will point out that Oscar was placed in genuinely mortal danger specifically because of skills Bryant taught him, danger he would likely never have faced at all had Bryant simply remained a distant, careful neighbor rather than an actively invested mentor. The film's own ending suggests it wants you to land on the first reading, but the second reading is not unreasonable, and the tension between those two readings is worth sitting with rather than dismissing simply because the story's plot mechanics ultimately reward Bryant's choice with a survivable, largely triumphant outcome. There's also a worthwhile point to raise about how the film handles the relationship between skill and safety, because the story's underlying assumption that competence and violence is the primary safeguard against danger deserves at least brief interrogation rather than uncritical acceptance. Bryant's entire response to every threat in this story runs through physical capability, and the film consistently validates that response by having his skills successfully resolve each danger he faces. This is a fairly standard genre assumption, but it's worth naming the specific worldview it encodes, that the world is fundamentally a place where danger is best met with superior physical force, rather than through the kind of institutional, community, or diplomatic solutions a different kind of film might have explored instead. This is not necessarily a criticism unique to this specific film so much as an observation about the genre it belongs to more broadly, but it's worth noting directly rather than letting the assumption pass entirely without comment, since the specific fantasy this genre offers, that a sufficiently skilled, sufficiently determined individual can reliably solve danger others cannot, carries its own quiet ideological weight regardless of how satisfying it proves within the specific confines of a 90-minute action thriller. It's also worth returning to the film's treatment of masculinity more directly, because Bryant's specific model of caring for Oscar, expressed almost entirely through physical training and protective violence rather than through verbal emotional support, reflects a particular, fairly traditional vision of what male caretaking looks like that the film neither fully endorses nor meaningfully questions. Bryant never sits down with Oscar for an extended conversation about grief, loss, or emotional processing. He teaches him to fight, and the film treats that teaching as functionally equivalent to emotional support, a conflation worth naming directly rather than accepting uncritically simply because Oscar's arc does genuinely improve as a result of Bryant's involvement. A version of this same story willing to sit with Bryant's own emotional limitations more directly, perhaps showing him attempting and struggling with more conventional emotional communication before falling scaling back on the physical training he's actually comfortable with, might have offered a more complex account of masculine caretaking than the version this film ultimately settles for, which largely accepts physical mentorship as sufficient without examining what it might be substituting for or avoiding in the process. There is also a comparative point worth raising about how this film's approach to violence differs from the more stylized, almost balletic action choreography popularized by the John Wick franchise and its many imitators across the broader action genre landscape in recent years, where that specific tradition treats violence with an almost operatic visual grandeur, elaborate sustained takes, meticulously choreographed gun-fu sequences designed as much for aesthetic spectacle as narrative function. As Good as Dead keeps its violence considerably more grounded and utilitarian throughout. Fights here read as genuinely dangerous, physically costly encounters rather than as elegant displays of choreographed skill for its own sake, which suits the film's broader emotional register considerably better than a more stylized approach would have. This distinction matters for understanding where this film sits within the contemporary action landscape. It is closer in spirit to earlier, more grounded action traditions than to the increasingly stylized, spectacle-driven direction a significant portion of the genre has moved toward in recent years. And that grounded quality is consistent with the film's broader emphasis on character and consequence over pure visual spectacle. Before this section closes, it's worth naming plainly what kind of critical engagement a film at this specific budget and ambition level typically receives, and how that context should inform how seriously to take both its genuine strengths and its acknowledged weaknesses. Films occupying this modest, direct-to-streaming corner of the action thriller genre rarely receive the kind of sustained critical attention afforded to higher-profile releases, often dismissed wholesale as disposable genre content regardless of the specific craft choices individual entries might actually demonstrate. This analysis has tried to resist that wholesale dismissal, taking the film's genuine structural intelligence around mentorship, restraint, and thematic coherence seriously while still naming its real weaknesses in dialogue, pacing, and certain narrative shortcuts honestly rather than either inflating its ambitions beyond what it actually achieves or dismissing its genuine successes simply because of its modest scale and budget. There's a final structural observation worth making about how the film balances its three central relationships, Bryant and Oscar, Bryant and Marisol, and Bryant and Kilbane, because the way these three threads are weighted against each other reveals something specific about where the film's genuine interests actually lie. The Bryant-Oscar relationship receives by far the most screen time and the most careful character development, confirming that this is fundamentally a mentorship story wearing the structural clothing of an action thriller rather than the reverse. The Bryant-Marisol relationship receives less direct attention, but is handled with enough restraint and specificity to avoid feeling like a purely functional romantic subplot bolted onto the main story. The Bryant-Kilbane relationship, despite driving the film's most visible external stakes, actually receives the least developed characterization of the three, with Kilbane functioning more as a well-executed genre device than as a fully three-dimensional antagonist with his own interior life beyond his grievance and his patient pursuit of vengeance. This weighting is worth naming directly because it clarifies what the film actually prioritizes beneath its marketing as a straightforward action thriller: character and relationship over plot mechanics and villain development, a choice that serves the film's genuine strengths even while leaving its antagonists somewhat thinner than a version of this story more interested in exploring Kilbane's own psychology might have delivered instead. It's also worth naming honestly what this weighting costs the film in terms of pure genre satisfaction, because a more balanced treatment of Kilbane might have made the film's climactic confrontation carry even more weight than it currently does. As it stands, Kilbane functions effectively as a symbol of Bryant's unresolved past and as a credible physical threat, but the film gives us relatively little insight into what specifically drives him beyond the straightforward, if believable, logic of a crime boss avenging a betrayal that cost him his organization. A version of this story willing to spend even one additional scene inside Kilbane's own perspective, exploring what exactly he lost when Bryant testified against him, and what specifically he hopes to reclaim by finally finding him, might have given the climactic confrontation an additional layer of tragic inevitability that the current version, competent as it is, does not quite reach. This is worth naming as a specific, addressable gap rather than a fatal flaw, since the film's other strengths largely compensate for this particular shortfall in villain depth. There is also a point worth making about how effectively the film manages its relatively compact runtime, because pacing discipline within a modest budget is itself a meaningful craft achievement worth crediting grieving directly. The film does not pad itself with unnecessary subplots or extended sequences that exist purely to stretch its length toward a more conventional feature runtime. Every major sequence connects directly back to one of the three central relationships already discussed, and the film's willingness to stay tightly focused on those relationships rather than diffusing attention across a larger, more sprawling supporting cast keeps its emotional through line considerably clearer than a more bloated version of the same premise might have managed. This discipline is easy to take for granted in a well-executed film, but it deserves specific recognition because plenty of comparable genre entries at this budget level struggle considerably more with pacing and focus than this particular film ultimately does across its full runtime. There is a specific detail about Bryant's chosen name worth examining more closely than most coverage of this film bothers to, because the alias itself carries a small but genuine piece of characterization easy to overlook amid the film's more visible plot mechanics. Unlike a more elaborate, clearly fabricated cover identity, Bryant reads as a deliberately ordinary, forgettable choice, the kind of plain, unremarkable name specifically selected to blend into a crowd rather than draw any curiosity toward its bearer. This small detail reinforces the same broader psychology this analysis has already traced through his physical stillness and his careful, controlled behavior throughout the film's opening act. Everything about how Bryant has constructed his new identity, from his name to his posture to his daily routines, has been optimized for exactly one goal: disappearing as completely and as unremarkably as possible into his surroundings. The film trusts this detail to register quietly rather than calling attention to it directly. Another example of the visual and behavioral storytelling this analysis has credited throughout as one of the film's more consistent, underrated strengths. It's worth returning to the film's opening shots with the benefit of hindsight, because the way the film chooses to first introduce its setting and its protagonist rewards a second look once you understand everything that eventually follows. The camera lingers on the ordinary rhythms of the town itself before it ever settles fully on Bryant specifically, establishing the community's own daily texture as something worth noticing in its own right rather than simply as backdrop for a protagonist's arrival. This choice matters for how the film's later engagement with community and belonging eventually lands, because it establishes from the very first minutes that this town has its own life and its own rhythms independent of Bryant's presence within it, a foundation that makes his eventual integration into that community, imperfect and complicated as this analysis has already noted it to be, feel more earned than it would if the film had simply treated the setting as empty scenery waiting for its protagonist to arrive and give it meaning. The recurring motif of screens and cameras throughout this film deserves more sustained attention than the single mention this analysis gave it earlier when discussing the viral video's mechanics directly, because the theme actually threads through the story more consistently than that isolated moment alone suggests. Early in the film, before the fight video ever exists, there are small, easy-to-miss moments of Bryant avoiding cameras in entirely mundane contexts, declining to be photographed at a local gathering, positioning himself carefully at the edges of group photos. Small behavioral tics that read on a first viewing as simple character quirks, but that retroactively reveal themselves as a consistent, deliberate survival strategy once the video's consequences become clear. This is worth naming as quiet, effective foreshadowing rather than coincidence, planting the specific danger of visibility well before the plot's central mechanism ever makes that danger explicit. In the same tradition of visual setup and payoff this analysis has already credited elsewhere in the film's craft. Hector's crew members, largely undifferentiated as individuals throughout most of the film, deserve at least brief acknowledgement here, because their relative facelessness is itself a meaningful, if perhaps unintentional, choice worth naming honestly as both a strength and a limitation. On one hand, keeping Hector's crew largely undifferentiated serves the film's tight focus on its central relationships, avoiding the diffusion of attention across a larger supporting cast that this analysis has already credited as a genuine structural strength. On the other hand, it also means the film's broader critique of gang recruitment, its argument that these organizations offer genuine, if corrupted, belonging to vulnerable young people, remains somewhat abstract, illustrated primarily through Hector himself and Oscar's own temptation rather than through any fuller picture of who actually populates that world and what specifically draws them into it beyond Oscar's individual case. There is also a specific thematic thread worth pulling on regarding the concept of chosen family versus biological family, because the film's final configuration of Bryant, Oscar, and Marisol as a functional family unit deserves deserves closer examination than a simple happy ending observation provides. Oscar has lost his mother, Bryant, though the film never confirms this explicitly, gives every indication of having similarly lost whatever family or community connections he once had when he entered witness protection, cut off entirely from his prior life as a condition of his continued safety. Marisol, now functioning as her younger brother's primary guardian, has effectively already been thrust into a parental role well beyond her own years. Each of these three characters arrives at the story carrying a specific kind of family absence or family burden, and the film's ending suggests, without stating it directly, that they have assembled something functionally resembling a family unit out of those separate absences. Three people whose individual losses have positioned them to fill gaps in each other's lives that none of them could fill alone. This reading gives the film's relatively quiet, unspectacular final scene considerably more emotional weight than its modest visual presentation might initially suggest, retroactively reframing the entire story as being about family formation under duress rather than simply about surviving external threats. It's worth considering how this theme of assembled, chosen family connects back to the film's earlier established tension between institutional systems and personal relationships discussed in the previous section of this analysis. Bryant's original family, in the broadest sense, the police department he served, the witness protection program that relocated him, represented exactly the kind of institutional structure this analysis already identified him as implicitly distrusting by the film's climax. The family he ultimately builds instead, informal, unofficial, assembled through chosen mutual investment rather than institutional assignment, stands in direct contrast to that earlier, institutionally mediated relationship that ultimately failed to keep him fully safe. Read this way, the film's ending is not simply a warm, sentimental image of found family for its own sake. It is the culmination of the film's broader, quieter argument about where genuine safety and genuine belonging actually come from, not from official systems designed to provide protection from a distance, but from direct, chosen, reciprocal relationships built through shared risk and sustained investment over time. There's also a specific narrative choice worth examining regarding what the film declines to show us about Bryant's future beyond its closing scene. We never learn whether he faces any legal consequences for the violence enacted against Kilbane's men, whether his continued presence in this specific town remains sustainable now that his location has already been compromised once, or what long-term plan, if any, he has for maintaining his safety going forward, given that the video which originally exposed him presumably still exists somewhere online regardless of Kilbane's personal defeat. This open-endedness is worth naming directly rather than treating it as a simple loose end left unaddressed by an oversight in the script. The film seems to want you to accept its ending as an emotional resolution rather than a fully practical one, prioritizing the resolved state of Bryant's relationships over any tidy confirmation that his broader situation has been definitively, permanently secured. Whether that prioritization satisfies you as a viewer likely depends on how much weight you personally place on emotional versus practical closure in this kind of story, a genuinely reasonable point of disagreement the film's ending leaves available rather than closing off entirely. Before moving toward this analysis's closing section, it's worth acknowledging directly the specific audience this deeper reading has been built for, distinct from the audience a more conventional plot summary of this film would serve. If you came to this analysis primarily wanting confirmation of whether this film delivers satisfying action sequences and a competent mentor-protege story, the answer across everything this analysis has covered is a fairly clear yes, with the specific caveats around dialogue, pacing, and villain development already named honestly along the way. But if you are the kind of viewer who finds genuine value in examining how a modestly budgeted genre film encodes larger questions about institutional trust, chosen family, and the specific costs of both isolation and connection, this film rewards that closer attention considerably more than its relatively unassuming marketing and modest scale might initially suggest to a casual observer scrolling past it on a streaming platform. One final observation worth making before this section closes concerns how the film's relatively muted critical and cultural footprint relates to its actual craft achievements, a gap worth naming directly rather than ignoring. Films occupying this specific space in the action thriller genre, modestly budgeted, built around a recognizable but not headline-dominating lead performer, released without significant theatrical marketing push, frequently disappear from cultural conversation almost immediately regardless of their actual quality, simply because the current media landscape offers such limited attention and discovery pathways for genre films that don't arrive with major studio marketing support behind them. This film's relative obscurity says considerably more about the current economics and discovery mechanics of the streaming era than it does about the actual level of craft on display across its mentorship story, its restrained villain performance, and its generally disciplined pacing, a gap between actual quality and cultural visibility worth naming directly as this analysis moves toward its concluding thoughts. There's a smaller detail about the film's treatment of Marisol's guardianship worth naming before this section closes, because it quietly reinforces the film's broader interest in improvised, unofficial family structures assembled under pressure rather than through conventional legal or institutional channels. The film never dwells on the formal legal mechanics of her guardianship over Oscar following their mother's death, treating it instead as simply the practical, unremarkable reality of their situation, a young woman stepping into a caretaking role because circumstance required it rather than because any formal process assigned it to her. This mirrors, in a smaller and more domestic register, the same pattern the film establishes through Bryant's own relationship to Oscar. Genuine care and genuine responsibility, in this story's worldview, tend to emerge from direct necessity and direct relationship rather than from official designation. And the film's consistent interest in that pattern across multiple relationships suggests it is doing more than simply reflecting realistic circumstance. It is quietly, consistently arguing for a specific vision of family and responsibility that values lived commitment over formal structure throughout its entire runtime, not merely in its more visible central mentorship story. It's also worth reflecting briefly on how this film's relatively compact, focused approach compares favorably against the more sprawling franchise ambitions that dominate a significant portion of the contemporary action genre. Many modern action films arrive burdened with franchise-building obligations, extended universe setup, sequel-baiting cliffhangers, or expansive ensemble casts designed to support future spin-off potential rather than serving the specific story actually being told in the film itself. As Good as Dead carries none of that structural baggage, functioning as a genuinely self-contained story with a clear beginning, middle, and end, resolved fully within its own runtime. Without gesturing toward larger cinematic universe ambitions, it has no genuine need to service. This self-containment is increasingly rare in contemporary genre filmmaking, and it deserves specific credit as a structural choice, allowing the film to devote its full attention to the specific relationships and specific stakes established within its own boundaries rather than diffusing energy across franchise considerations that would inevitably compete with its more intimate, character-focused ambitions. There is a genuinely contrarian reading of Kilbane worth putting forward directly, because almost every piece of coverage treats him as a straightforward, one-dimensional revenge-driven antagonist, and while the film gives him relatively little interior development, as this analysis already noted, the specific logic driving him deserves more careful consideration than dismissive genre shorthand typically allows. From Kilbane's own perspective, Bryant was not simply a witness fulfilling a civic obligation. He was an embedded operative who spent an extended period building trust within Kilbane's organization specifically in order to betray it, gathering evidence through sustained personal deception rather than through any more straightforward, less intimate form of investigation. Whatever criminal enterprise Kilbane was running, and the film gives us little detail about its specific nature or its specific victims, Kilbane experienced Bryant's infiltration as a profound personal betrayal by someone who had, by any measure, earned his trust through sustained, convincing deception. This does not make Kilbane's subsequent pursuit of lethal revenge justified in any moral sense the film asks you to endorse, but it does complicate the easy, uncomplicated read of him as simply a bad man doing bad things to a good man, replacing it with something closer to two men who each did something the other experienced as a profound violation, viewed from within their own respective, mutually exclusive frameworks of justice and betrayal. This contrarian reading matters because it clarifies something worth stating plainly about the entire witness protection premise this genre relies on so heavily, without much scrutiny. Bryant's testimony likely served genuine justice, dismantling a criminal organization that was, by every reasonable inference the film supports, causing real harm to real people. The film never asks you to doubt that Bryant's original choice to testify was the right one, but it also never fully reckons with the fact that undercover infiltration of this kind requires exactly the sustained, intimate deception Kilbane experienced as betrayal, a tension inherent to this entire category of law enforcement work that the film gestures toward through its title and its central premise without ever directly interrogating. Bryant spent an extended period being genuinely trusted by people he was simultaneously simultaneously working to destroy. And the film's title, As Good as Dead, arguably applies just as much to the specific moral position an undercover operative occupies during that infiltration period as it does to Bryant's later fugitive status, a person who is, in a real sense, already dead to the people around him the moment his deception becomes fully known, regardless of how justified that deception ultimately proves to be by its results. It's worth extending this, as good as dead, framing one step further to consider how it applies to Hector as well, closing out a pattern this analysis has traced across multiple characters without yet naming it as a unified thematic thread. Hector's authority within his own organization, as this analysis noted earlier, depends entirely on being feared and respected by the people beneath him, and Oscar's public defeat of his crew members represents a genuine, potentially fatal threat to that authority within his own criminal world regardless of how the story's central plot ultimately resolves for him personally. A man whose entire social position depends on maintaining fear and respect, once publicly humiliated in the way Hector is by Oscar's viral defeat of his men, is functionally as good as dead within his own specific social and criminal ecosystem even before Bryant's climactic confrontation with him ever occurs. His authority already fatally compromised the moment that footage started circulating regardless of what physically happens to him afterward. Three separate characters in this story, Vin, Bryant, Kilbane, and Hector, are each in their own distinct way living out some version of this same title's central idea, each one occupying a position where visibility, exposure, or loss of control over their own narrative threatens something as fundamental as literal survival, even when the actual threat manifests differently for each of them specifically. This is worth naming as the film's genuinely most sophisticated structural achievement, more interesting than its competent but relatively straightforward action mechanics might initially suggest to a casual viewer. A single title, applied with genuine thematic consistency across three distinct characters occupying three distinct positions of power and vulnerability, is a more ambitious piece of structural writing than this film typically receives credit for in casual coverage focused primarily on its action choreography and its central mentor-protege relationship. Whether this consistency was fully intentional on the part of the filmmakers or emerged more organically from a genre structure that naturally tends to distribute this kind of vulnerability across its major players is difficult to determine with certainty from the film alone, but the pattern itself is genuinely there to be noticed by anyone watching closely enough to track it across the full runtime. There's a moral dilemma worth sitting with directly regarding Bryant's original decision to testify against Kilbane in the first place, a decision that happened before this film's story begins, but which the entire plot exists as a consequence of. Was it worth the eventual cost, not just to Bryant himself, but to everyone eventually drawn into danger because of his choice, Oscar and Marisol included? The film clearly wants you to believe the answer is yes, treating Bryant's original testimony as an unambiguous act of civic good that merely happened to carry unfortunate long-term consequences. But a harder, less comfortable version of this question asks whether an individual's choice to pursue justice through a system that ultimately could not fully protect him afterward was actually the responsible choice, given everything it eventually put at risk for people who had no say in that original decision at all. Oscar and Marisol did not choose to become entangled in Bryant's past. They inherited danger created by a decision made years before either of them ever met him, and the film's ultimate validation of Bryant's original choice through the story's largely triumphant resolution sidesteps this harder question rather than fully engaging with it. It's worth pairing that dilemma with a genuinely dual interpretation of the film's closing family unit, because the warm, resolved final image this analysis discussed earlier admits at least two meaningfully different readings depending on how much weight you place on the unresolved practical questions also discussed. Read one way, the ending represents genuine, hard-won triumph. Three people who found each other through shared adversity, choosing connection despite real danger, having successfully weathered that danger together and emerged stronger and more bonded for having done so. Read another way, the ending represents something considerably more precarious. Three people whose safety remains genuinely uncertain, having defeated one specific threat while leaving the underlying vulnerability that created that threat, Bryant's continued visibility and continued risk of future exposure, essentially unaddressed. Both readings are legitimately supported by what the film actually shows you, and the tension between them is worth holding on to rather than collapsing entirely into the more comfortable, purely triumphant reading the film's overall tone and pacing gently encourages you toward in its closing minutes. There's also a specific comparative angle worth raising about how this film's ending differs meaningfully from a more conventional conventional rides off into the sunset alone, resolution common to a significant portion of this genre's history. Many action thrillers built around a protagonist with a dangerous past resolve that danger by having the protagonist ultimately depart, protecting the people they've come to care about precisely by removing themselves from those relationships once the immediate threat has passed, a pattern rooted in the assumption that a dangerous man's genuine act of love is distance rather than continued presence. This film explicitly rejects that pattern. Bryant does not leave once Kilbane and Hector are dealt with. He stays, choosing continued presence and continued vulnerability over the safer, more emotionally guarded alternative of departure. This is worth naming as a meaningful genre departure rather than simply accepting it as an unremarkable happy ending, because it represents the film taking an explicit position on a long-standing genre convention, arguing directly against the idea that loving someone dangerous means eventually leaving them for their own protection, and instead arguing that staying, with everything that continued presence risks, is the more genuine expression of the connection the story has spent its entire runtime building. This choice connects directly back to everything this analysis has already traced about the film's broader thematic interests, its skepticism toward institutional protection, its investment in chosen family over biological or official structures, and its consistent argument that genuine safety was never really about isolation in the first place. A more conventional version of this story, one that had Bryant depart at its conclusion to protect Oscar and Marisol from his continued danger, would have ultimately reaffirmed the same isolationist logic Bryant spent the entire film's first act operating under before Oscar's presence in his life began to change it. Instead, the film lets its protagonist complete a genuine arc from isolation toward connection and commits to that arc fully through its ending rather than reverting to isolation once the immediate external danger has been resolved, which is precisely why this film's relatively modest, unspectacular closing scene carries more genuine emotional and thematic weight than its quiet, understated presentation might initially suggest to a viewer expecting a louder, more conventionally triumphant final beat. There is one more thread worth pulling before this section closes, connecting back to the earlier discussion of masculinity and emotional communication, because Bryant's decision to stay rather than depart also represents a specific kind of emotional risk-taking this analysis has otherwise credited him with avoiding through most of the film. Staying requires him to remain vulnerable to exactly the kind of connection and dependency he spent years training himself to avoid, and it requires him to accept an ongoing, unresolved level of danger to people he cares about rather than resolving that danger definitively through his own removal from their lives. This is arguably a harder, more emotionally exposed choice than fighting Kilbane and Hector, both of which draw on skills and instincts Bryant has spent his entire adult life honing and trusting. Choosing to remain present, vulnerable, and permanently entangled in other people's ongoing risk is a choice that draws on an entirely different, considerably less practiced part of his character, and the film's decision to end on this quieter, harder choice rather than on the more conventionally satisfying physical victory over Kilbane suggests the story understands, even if it never states it directly through dialogue, that this emotional choice is ultimately the more significant one of the two. It's worth considering, too, how Marisol's own arc across the film models a parallel version of this same emotional risk, worth naming directly as a piece of thematic symmetry the film builds without calling explicit attention to it. She begins the story wary of Bryant specifically because his presence introduces risk into her already precarious situation as her brother's sole guardian, and her gradual willingness to extend trust despite that risk mirrors, on a smaller scale, the same choice Bryant himself is making by staying rather than departing. Both characters, across the film's runtime, move from a defensive posture built around minimizing risk and protecting what little stability they have toward a more open, more vulnerable posture that accepts genuine risk in exchange for genuine connection. This parallel arc gives the film's central relationships a structural coherence worth crediting specifically, since it means the story's thematic argument about connection over isolation is not simply demonstrated through Bryant's individual journey alone, but reinforced through a second character's independently traced version of essentially the same emotional arc. Before this section closes, it's worth stepping back to consider what this film ultimately asks of its audience compared to a more straightforward, less demanding entry in the same genre. A purely mechanical action thriller asks relatively little of its viewer beyond following the plot and enjoying the choreography. This film, whatever its acknowledged imperfections in dialogue, pacing, and villain development discussed throughout this analysis, asks its audience to hold several genuinely genuinely unresolved tensions simultaneously. The tension between institutional and personal justice, the tension between the safety of isolation and the risk of genuine connection, and the tension between a triumphant emotional reading of its ending and a more precarious, practically unresolved one. That willingness to leave real tension unresolved, even within a genre that typically favors clean, unambiguous resolution, is worth crediting as a meaningful, if modest, ambition beyond what this film's marketing or its position within a crowded, often disposable corner of the streaming action landscape might initially suggest to a viewer approaching it with lower expectations. There is one last comparison worth drawing before this analysis closes for good, and it concerns the three fates this story ultimately hands out, because laid side by side they reveal something this film is arguing even without stating it through a single line of dialogue. Kilbane, who pursued his grievance to its logical, violent conclusion, ends the film defeated, his years of patient waiting resolved not in vindication but in loss. Hector, whose authority depended entirely on fear and control, ends the film having lost both, his standing destroyed as thoroughly by Oscar's public defeat of his men as by anything Bryant does to him directly in their final confrontation. Bryant, the man who spent years defining safety as invisibility, ends the film visible, connected, and vulnerable, having traded the specific safety he once prized for something the film clearly wants you to understand as more valuable, even though it is considerably less secure. None of these three men get exactly what they set out to achieve at the story's beginning. What they get instead is the specific consequence their own choices, made long before this particular story even started, eventually earned them, distributed according to how each of them chose to relate to power, fear, and connection across their respective histories. It's worth being direct about what this distribution implies for how the film ultimately wants you to feel walking away from it. This is not a story that argues violence itself is heroic or admirable in some abstract sense. It is a story that argues connection, chosen and sustained even at real risk, is worth considerably more than the safety purchased through isolation, and that the specific courage required to remain vulnerable to other people, after every rational instinct built through years of hard experience argues for retreat instead, is the harder and more meaningful courage this story actually cares about. Bryant's physical courage was never really in question. He demonstrated real skill and real capability from his very first confrontation. What the film actually tracks across its full runtime is a different kind of courage entirely, considerably less visible in any single action sequence, building gradually across small choices to stay rather than flee, to reveal rather than conceal, to remain present rather than retreat, right up through the final decision to stay in this town with these specific people rather than disappearing once more into a safer, quieter, more isolated version of the life he had before Oscar ever walked into it. Tell me directly, without reaching for the easy answer, was Bryant's choice to stay the right one, given everything it required Oscar and Marisol to risk alongside him? Or would a version of this story that had him leave, protecting them through distance rather than continued presence, have actually been the more responsible ending? Some of you will land firmly on the side of connection, arguing that a life spent protecting people from a distance is not really a relationship at all, and that Oscar and Marisol, given genuine choice in the matter, would clearly rather have Bryant present and imperfectly safe than absent and theoretically more secure. Others will land somewhere more skeptical, arguing that Bryant's choice to stay ultimately serves his own emotional needs as much as anyone else's safety, and that a genuinely selfless version of this same character might have recognized that his continued presence, however emotionally satisfying for everyone involved, still leaves the people he cares about carrying real, ongoing risk they did not choose for themselves. Neither answer is wrong, and the specific answer you land on likely says as much about how you personally weigh safety against connection in your own relationships as it does about anything the film definitively resolves on screen. If there is one final thought worth carrying out of this film and back into your own life, let it be this. Most of us, in smaller and less dramatic ways than Bryant's specific circumstances demand, face some version of the same choice this story dramatizes at genre scale, whether to keep the people around us at a safe, manageable distance, protecting ourselves and them from whatever risk genuine closeness inevitably introduces, or whether to accept that risk directly, choosing presence and vulnerability over the considerably safer, considerably lonelier alternative of controlled, careful distance. This film's quietest argument, buried underneath its fight choreography and its border town crime plotting, is that the second choice, however much more it costs and however much less certain its outcome, is ultimately the only one that produces anything resembling an actual life worth defending in the first place. It's worth taking one more look back across across everything this analysis has traced, because the pattern connecting all of it only becomes fully visible once you can see the whole shape at once rather than any single piece in isolation. Bryant's careful, camera-avoiding stillness in the film's opening scenes quietly established the exact vulnerability that would eventually undo him, well before the viral video ever entered the plot directly. The title's meaning expanded gradually across three separate characters rather than remaining confined to Bryant's own literal danger. The film's consistent skepticism toward institutional protection, quietly built into a former officer's choice to resolve his own crisis entirely through personal action, ran underneath the entire back half of the story without ever being stated as an explicit thesis. And the ending's insistence on staying rather than departing completed an arc about connection over isolation that the film had been building patiently and consistently since its very first quiet scene of a man deliberately avoiding a group photograph. None of these threads function as isolated details scattered for attentive viewers to collect. They are the load-bearing architecture of a single, coherent argument about what genuine safety actually requires. Built with more consistency and more genuine craft than this film's modest scale and modest cultural footprint might initially suggest to anyone approaching it with lowered expectations simply because of where and how it was released. This is exactly the gap this analysis set out to close from its opening minutes, and it's worth being direct about why that gap mattered enough to justify this level of depth applied to a film this modestly budgeted and this easily overlooked. Most coverage of a film like this treats its value as located almost entirely in whether its action sequences deliver satisfying spectacle and whether its central performances carry sufficient charisma to hold attention across 90 minutes. That coverage is not wrong about what the film delivers on that level. It is simply incomplete about why any of it actually lands the way it does, because the emotional and thematic weight of this story was never sitting purely in its choreography or its cast. It was distributed carefully across a consistent visual language of concealment and exposure, a title doing more structural work than its genre-standard phrasing initially suggests, and a genuinely considered argument about the relative value of safety and connection that the film never once states outright, but consistently, patiently demonstrates through every major character's arc across its full runtime. There's a specific kind of viewer this deeper approach serves best, worth naming directly rather than assuming everyone watching wanted the same thing from this analysis. If you came here primarily wanting confirmation of whether this is a competently made, entertaining action thriller worth your time, the answer across everything covered here is a genuine, if appropriately qualified yes, complete with the specific weaknesses in dialogue, pacing, and villain development already named honestly along the way rather than glossed over for the sake of easier praise. But if you are the kind of viewer who finds real value in noticing how a modest, easily overlooked genre film can encode a genuinely coherent argument about institutional trust, chosen family, and the cost of both isolation and connection, spread carefully across character choices most casual viewings would never fully register. This film rewards exactly that kind of patient attention considerably more than its unassuming marketing, its modest budget, or its position in a crowded streaming catalog might lead you to expect walking in. Before this closes for good, it's worth restating plainly what makes a film like this worth this level of sustained attention, because that justification is ultimately the entire argument for everything this 10-part analysis has attempted across its full runtime. A disposable genre film gives you competent action and forgettable characters, content that momentary entertainment was sufficient payment for your attention, and nothing further needs to be said about it once the credits roll. As Good as Dead, whatever its genuine, honestly acknowledged imperfections, gives you something more durable underneath its familiar genre packaging. A specific, coherent argument about what actually makes a life worth protecting, delivered through three distinct characters, each working out their own version of the exact same underlying question, in a story confident enough in its own craft to trust you to notice the pattern connecting them without ever needing to explain it to you directly. And that, ultimately, is the difference between the version of this story most casual viewers will carry away after a single watch and the version this analysis has tried to reconstruct across everything covered here. Most people will remember As Good as Dead as a competent, modest action movie about a hidden man forced back into violence by a viral video. That memory is not incorrect, but it is the smallest possible container for what this film actually accomplishes across its full runtime. The fuller version of this story is about a man who learned, at real cost, that the safety he built through disappearance was never actually the same thing as a life worth living. It is about a grieving teenager who found, through unlikely thematically mentorship, both the discipline to protect himself and the deeper evidence that he mattered enough for someone to genuinely invest in him. It is about a young woman who chose, deliberately and with clear eyes, to accept real danger into her family's life because the alternative, permanent caution and permanent distance, no longer felt like the safer choice once she understood what genuine presence actually looked like. And it is about the specific, quiet courage required to stop being as good as dead, in whichever sense of that phrase applies most directly to your own life, and choose instead to be fully, riskily, unmistakably alive. Thank you for sitting with this full breakdown of As Good as Dead. If this deeper reading of a film usually treated as disposable genre entertainment changed how you'll think about it the next time it comes up, or if you disagree entirely with how much weight this analysis has placed on a modestly budgeted action thriller, say so in the comments. Either reaction means the film, and hopefully this breakdown of it, actually earned your attention rather than simply filling 90 minutes of your evening. There is a quiet symmetry worth leaving you with as this analysis closes, tying back to the very first image this breakdown opened on. The film began with a man disappearing on purpose, structuring his entire existence around being unseen. It ends with that same man standing in plain view, beside the people he chose to stay for, no longer optimizing for invisibility but for presence. Nothing about that shift is loud. There is no dramatic speech marking the change, no title card confirming it explicitly. The film simply lets you watch a man who spent years disappearing choose, finally, to be found, and trust that after everything you have now seen him risk to get there, you will understand exactly what that quiet choice actually cost him, and exactly why the story believes it was worth it.